Welcome back to the deep dive. Great to have you with us again. You know the drill. We get this pile of source material, articles, research, sometimes even internal memos, and we dig in together. Our job is to pull out the key insights, those surprising details, and basically give you the shortcut to really understanding what's going on. Today, we're tackling a really dramatic hypothetical scenario, a U.S. attack on Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, let's be clear, this isn't current news, okay? It's based on a very detailed scenario built for analysis. We want to really unpack the details and the potential consequences laid out in these sources we've got.
Yeah, and what really jumps out from this materials is just how incredibly complicated something like this would be. So many facets. The sources actually lay out a very specific kind of step-by-step chain of events. So our mission here is to get into the what exactly happens in this scenario, the why, the reasons given in these sources, and crucially, the potential what next. All drawn straight from this information. It really forces you to think about the knock-on effects.
Okay, so let's dive right in. The scenario, it starts big. The sources throw us straight into the deep end. The United States launches a series of precision airstrikes against Iranian nuclear sites. Hypothetical, yes, but the way it's written, it feels incredibly immediate. High stakes.
And the core reason given, the justification in these documents, it hinges on a specific claim that Iran was getting dangerously close to a weapons-grade enrichment threshold. The source is very specific here, saying Iran went over the 60% uranium enrichment limit and was heading towards, well, 90% weapons grade. That jump from 60 to 90%, that's often called the short dash to a bomb. So according to this scenario, that was the line that got crossed, that perceived critical threshold.
And these weren't like random bombings either. The sources are really specific about the targets, which feels
Yeah.
significant, right? It seems to tell us something about the strategy behind it all in this scenario. We're talking underground bunkers, enrichment plants, missile development centers. Hitting those specific things, what does that tell us about the threat they were supposedly trying to counter here?
Well, it suggests a kind of dual focus, doesn't it? It seems the aim wasn't just destroying the enriched material they might have had already, but also crippling the infrastructure. The centrifuges for future enrichment, and this is key, the potential delivery systems, missiles. So it points towards a pretty comprehensive effort, at least in this scenario, to dismantle what was seen as an active, accelerating nuclear weapons program, from the raw material right up to potentially the warhead itself.
Okay, so that sets the stage, the what happened. But the sources then dig into the why. What were the main justifications presented for such a drastic move?
Right. So first and foremost, it circles back to what we just mentioned, the alleged violation of nuclear limits. The scenario really emphasizes Iran's supposed enrichment levels, pushing way beyond what was agreed or, seen as acceptable. This wasn't just ticking a box. The sources frame it as a direct challenge, a threat to non-proliferation efforts globally.
And it wasn't just the technical stuff, the enrichment levels. The sources also talk about a long, frustrating failure of diplomacy. They point to years of stalled talks after the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, kind of fell apart, and Iran apparently refusing IAEA inspections, the International Atomic Energy Agency. That paints a picture of, well, a diplomatic roadblock.
Exactly, a dead end, which then, according to the sources, leads to the role of intelligence reports. The material suggests that U.S. and Israeli intelligence supposedly found evidence, compelling evidence, it says, of a secret Iranian program, a program specifically to weaponize the enriched uranium. So not just making the material, but figuring how to put it in a bomb, basically. And that kind of intelligence, if it was seen as credible, like the scenario suggests, well, that would likely be a huge factor in any decision, maybe the factor.
And there's one more layer here. The sources mention pressure from Israel, significant pressure. Israel, obviously feeling very threatened by the idea of Iran getting a nuclear bomb, is depicted here as potentially lobbying hard, maybe even coordinating closely with the U.S. behind the scenes, which definitely raises questions about the dynamics between those allies in this specific context. Okay, so we've got the why or the claimed why from these sources, but the material also gives us this incredibly detailed look at the actual targets. These were precision strikes, not carpet bombing. What exactly did they hit?
Yeah, the sources list several key places. Top of the list seems to be the Fordow fuel enrichment plant. And what's crucial about Fordow, and the sources stress this, is that it's buried deep underground, near Qom. That's not just a detail. It means it's hardened, tough to hit, which is why they specifically mention using bunker buster bombs. That tells you something about the perceived importance of the target and the scale of the military operation required.
Then there's Natanz, the Natanz nuclear facility. The sources describe that as like a main hub for centrifuges and enrichment. That's the engine room, basically, isn't it, for producing the fuel?
Absolutely. Hitting Natanz would be a major blow to their ability to make highly enriched uranium. Another place mentioned is the Isfahan Research Center. That was suspected of being involved in making components for nuclear weapons. So you see, it broadens the scope. They weren't just hitting enrichment. They were apparently targeting different stages of the whole nuclear fuel cycle.
And Parchin. The Parchin military complex is on the list, too. The sources link that to testing things like missile warheads and maybe nuclear triggers. So again, hitting potential delivery systems, not just the fuel. It's a very thorough target list in this scenario.
Definitely. And beyond those big-name sites, the sources say the strikes also hit other, maybe less known, underground bunkers and storage areas, places supposedly holding more centrifuges, maybe plutonium, more uranium, essentially trying to cover all the bases, aiming to deliver a really comprehensive setback to the entire program, as perceived in this scenario.
Okay, so the bombs fall. What happens next? The sources describe Iran's reaction as, well, almost instant, and coming from multiple directions. It wasn't just one thing, it was multi-pronged. What did that immediate response look like?
Well, the first thing detailed is direct military action. Missile launches. Iran apparently fired dozens of missiles, aimed at U.S. bases in Iraq and also in the Persian Gulf. This wasn't just, firing a warning shot. It was a forceful kinetic response, showing they could hit back in the region.
And it wasn't just missiles, right? The sources also talk about cyber attacks, a different kind of warfare.
Yes, significant cyber attacks.
Yeah.
Iranian hackers supposedly going after U.S. infrastructure, maybe energy grids, trying to cause disruption, maybe chaos, without necessarily engaging militarily head-on in that same way.
And then there's the proxy element, which seems really significant.
Hugely significant. The sources talk about widespread Hezbollah threats. Iranian-backed groups, not just Hezbollah in Lebanon, but also in Syria, Iraq, all threatening Israeli and American interests across the region. It shows that broader asymmetric strategy, using their network of proxies to expand the conflict zone, basically.
So things escalate incredibly quickly, and the shockwaves, they go global almost instantly. How did the rest of the world react in this scenario?
Predictably, perhaps. The sources say Russia and China came out very strongly against the U.S. action, condemned it swiftly, calling it unprovoked aggression, which, immediately highlights those big geopolitical divides, sort of like old times in a way.
And the European Union, what was their reaction, according to the sources?
The reported response was to push for an emergency UN meeting, expressing deep fears about diplomacy just completely collapsing and, the risk of wider instability in the region really underscores how interconnected everything is.
And the United Nations itself.
The UN as a whole, the sources say, urged calm, called for immediate de-escalation, trying to pull things back from the brink, get people talking again, reflecting that global instinct to try and contain a crisis like this.
Wow. And then there's the economic fallout, which the sources say was immediate and, frankly, staggering. Oil prices surging 30% overnight, just like that, because of fears of a Gulf blockade. I mean, 30%, that's massive. That affects everyone, everywhere, instantly.
It really does. The economic impact is often just as immediate, sometimes more widespread, than the direct military stuff.
Which leads us to another critical point the sources raise, the whole question of legality. How did the U.S. justify this, according to the scenario? And what were the counter-arguments? Right. So the justification, as laid out here, was preemptive self-defense. That was the U.S. line described in the sources. But then the material immediately presents the other side. International law experts questioning it, asking, did this violate the UN Charter, specifically Article 2.4, the bit about not using force? Did it undermine the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? And just the basic sovereignty of Iran as a UN member state. Did the sources kind of lean one way or the other on which argument was stronger, or just present the debate?
It's presented very much as a fierce, ongoing debate. The sources acknowledge the U.S. claim of preemption, but they give a lot of weight to the concerns from the international legal community. They don't really pick a winner. Instead, they highlight this deep tension, between one nation feeling it needs to act preemptively to stop a threat and the established rules of international law designed to prevent exactly that kind of unilateral action. It really puts you in that complex gray area.
And that gray area leads to the biggest fear, doesn't it? The one hanging over this whole scenario in the source material. Could this spiral? Could it actually lead to something like World War III? It's a terrifying question.
It is. And the sources outline specific pathways for how that could happen. One major fear described is a wider regional war, not just U.S. versus Iran, but dragging in Israel, Saudi Arabia, other Gulf states, basically setting the entire Middle East on fire. the consequences would be unimaginable.
And beyond state versus state war, there's the proxy angle again.
Exactly. The sources talk about the potential for escalating proxy wars. U.S.-backed groups versus Iran-backed groups fighting it out even more intensely in places already unstable like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, spreading the conflict indirectly but still incredibly destructively.
And the long-term nightmare scenario.
That would be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. That's the ultimate chilling possibility highlighted here. If this scenario played out, the fear is that other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia, maybe Turkey, Egypt, might feel they have to get their own nuclear deterrent, leading to massive proliferation, making an already volatile region infinitely more dangerous.
Wow, okay. The implications laid out in these sources are just immense. Our aim today in this deep dive was really just to map out that complex chain of events and the potential fallout as described in the material we have, to give you a clearer picture of what such a crisis could look like based on this analysis.
Yeah, and this scenario, as it's presented, it forces you right into that core dilemma, doesn't it? Was this hypothetical action, as described, a necessary evil to stop an imminent threat? Or was it the first match struck in a firestorm that nobody could control? There are no easy answers in these documents.
Well, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into some really intense but important source material. We hope it's giving you a clear, maybe more nuanced perspective on these incredibly complex issues.
It'll leave you with a final thought, a question pulled directly from the source material itself, something to mull over. As the dust settles over the ruins, one question remains: was this a necessary action to stop a nuclear-armed Iran, or the first spark in a global war we cannot control? The world watches, breath held, as history is written in fire.